Doug, you had a look at Netflix spatial audio. Now, it's not something that probably the vast majority of our listeners or viewers will be interested in, because they'll already have multi-channel systems or stereo systems or some other solution. But this is more for the wider market, and very much device pertinent as well to what you're watching on it. And again, you need the settings correctly to be able to take advantage of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Essentially, what Netflix have done is they've teamed up with Sennheiser, and they're applying Sennheiser's Ambio 2-channel spatial audio technology to a selection of titles, and they're replacing the default stereo track for those titles. Essentially, what it's trying to achieve is to convey some of the sort of immersive effect that you would get from full fat Atmos, or the proper immersive audio track, but to reproduce that using only 2 channels. It's only available to premium plan subscribers, of course, so it's one of the sort of many ways that Netflix are seeking recently to sort of squeeze as much money as possible out of its current customers. And essentially, the way the technology works is it attempts to estimate how you would hear things in 3D space based on the shape of your ear and the shape of your head, essentially. And it applies filters to the audio track to kind of to mimic that. I mean, that's the basic principle. It's explained in much more depth in the review, and it's based on something called head-related transfer function, which is just how, you know, the shape of your head and the shape of your ear affect how you hear sounds in 3D space. So all that's to say that it's slightly more clever than just a slightly echoey effect, or a sort of church hall effect, attempting to estimate a slightly more spacious sound. And it's currently only available on a limited selection of titles, and as I said, replaces the stereo track. So in order to be able to access it, you have to be listening in stereo. If you're not listening in stereo, if you're outputting to a multi-channel system, that will report back to Netflix, which knows, and it just doesn't display the spatial audio logo, and it doesn't play back in spatial audio. So if you can't see the spatial audio logo before you press play, it means you're not going to be hearing it in spatial audio. And as I say, there are about 700 titles or so where it's available at the moment. In terms of how I found it, I mean, yeah, it was good. I can't sort of hand on heart say it is miles better than just a vanilla stereo track. But it did at times. I was flicking back and forth between stereo and spatial, and sort of I had to disable my multi-channel output and then re-enable it to switch between the two through 2 speakers. And there were times where the spatial audio track did seem to have a slightly more immersive effect than the default, than just normal stereo. And there were a couple of scenes in Stranger Things 4 where the sounds did seem to project slightly to the side. I mean, it wasn't convincing, not in the sense that, you know, I wouldn't for a moment think I had a speaker to the side of me. But it did genuinely at times sound surprisingly sort of immersive. One of the other good features of the way that it's applied is essentially there's a spatial audio renderer that sits sort of upstream from the content, and the sort of sound engineers can play around with that to rejig the sound how they want. So you can leave some stems, some channels completely sort of unmessed with. So you can apply the spatialization effect to the sort of the effects, but leave the dialogue completely untouched. And one of the sort of the more pronounced effects I noticed that the spatial audio track had is the dialogue did seem slightly more clear. And I wonder if that is a product of applying spatialization to everything else, but leaving the dialogue just untouched, and that sort of bringing the dialogue out slightly more. And that was particularly noticeable in some of the sort of Stranger Things scenes. And that in a sort of weird, ironic way might actually be the main benefit of spatial audio.
And it's certainly an angle I've seen being used, because there's been a lot of complaints recently of quite a number of TV shows where actors are mumbling, or it's very, very difficult to hear what's being said in the mix. And you got to think that that's maybe been one of the goals of this system, is to make dialogue that little bit clearer. And of course, you got to also take into account the different devices that people are going to be using to watch the content back. So it's not just on TV, is it, Doug? It's like watching on a laptop or
anything,
some other stereo. It's capable of stereo playback. So you're going to get that effect. I use my laptop to listen to a couple of the demo tracks. And like you say, it's very much, like I said, spatial audio. So you don't expect any sound effects or objects coming at you from different angles, but it just kind of widens that soundstage out a little bit, depending on what the scene is. And there's a little bit more stereo separation, I noticed, on a couple of the scenes. But again, it's very subtle in the way that it's done. And it's not in your face and over the top, which it shouldn't be anyway. It should just be there to help you enjoy the content a little bit more. So for those that don't have a multi-channel setup, do you feel it's offering anything over and above stereo, or do you think a decent stereo signal would probably give you the gist of what's going on?
I mean, there were times where it did seem to do something slightly more than stereo, and as you say, it was just that sort of widening of the soundstage and projecting some of the effects slightly, the sense of things coming at you slightly from the side, which stereo can achieve occasionally. And I've certainly heard music where that's achieved sort of very effectively. But on the whole, it doesn't, whereas spatial audio seems to have achieved that like reasonably regularly. So I do think it probably provides something slightly more immersive than straight stereo.
Yeah. Any other guys tried it out, had a look at it?
I haven't tried it. I'm intrigued. The one thing that did put my interest there was Doug talking about head-related transfer function, because the last time I heard anyone talk about that was DCS, when I tested the Bartok. Now, the Bartok probably isn't exactly what Netflix had in mind when they're thinking about spatial audio. I mean, the latest updates to it mean that it now costs £20,000. But DCS was using some of the same theories that have been applied to spatial audio for their Expanse headphone system. And I will say that for headphone listening, that was one of the most impressive and unobtrusive bits of processing I've ever used. So the mechanics are there to do some quite impressive things with it. It's one of those things where it's hard to judge exactly the point at which you pitch it, because my tendency listening through a reasonably ornate stereo system would be to not turn it on and not make use of it. And then if you drop below a certain point, the ability of the equipment that you're listening to move things around in a convincing way starts to dip. So there's a weirdly knit sort of narrow sweet spot about the sort of people that be using it, I suspect. I mean, I can't prove that. It's just me sticking a finger in the wind. And then that sort of then leads on to how much long-term sustained effort goes into creating these spatial fields. But I'm perfectly happy to give it a whirl, and I believe that it probably can be made to sound quite impressive. I've heard the same mechanics applied to things, and some genuinely excellent results come out. So be interested to see what they do with it, and whether it finds a happy niche somewhere between the multi-channel and the straight stereo soundtracks.
Jules, you had a chance to have a listen to this?
No. I've obviously in my cinema room, it's all multi-channel and everything. No, I've not had a chance to play with it, but next time I'm away on a trip and I've got my headphones and Netflix, I'll give it a whirl and see what it sounds like.
Yeah. Okay. So if anybody out there has experimented with this, you've had a bit play around, let us know what you think. You can leave your comments either in the live chat tonight if you're watching this live, or later in the week if you're listening back to the recorded podcast. Leave your comments in the comments thread in the podcast forum at AV Forums.